It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, to be offered the opportunity to start out this important conference that will extend physically today and then virtually next week, to consider the importance of security sector reform, its record of achievement, and the way forward. I'm certainly not an expert on the subject in an academic or technical sense, but I have, as a practitioner, observed the process in a variety of contexts when I worked in the Department of Defense and when I was in Iraq, starting the construction of a new Iraqi army as part of the effort, which is very much still ongoing and uncertain in result, to build a new set of security institutions for that very troubled country. So what you'll hear from me today is a perspective on the task of security sector reform from the vantage point of a policy official on the one hand, and of someone who's worked on the specific case in the field for a limited but important period of time. Security sector reform can, I think, fairly be defined, essentially, as Mark has done it, at a general level as shaping the security agencies of a country as well as the higher political structures that direct them so that they fit with the pattern of reforms that are simultaneously reshaping the nations which they serve. So in the past 20 years, a broad variety of nations have cast off old authoritarian regimes or that are seeking to modernize in other ways, and they have faced similar demands for creating a new or at least fundamentally reformed set of security institutions. And these countries vary tremendously from the former Soviet Empire, but also places as different as South Africa, a number of other African countries, Latin America, the Balkans, East Timor, Taiwan and South Korea, and, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq. In my remarks, I propose to try to outline what I believe we've learned from the cases that I know about directly, recognizing, of course, that the experience of each country is in some degree peculiar to that country, and that lessons from one case may not be valid for another. The process is still incomplete even where it started out, which in some sense I think, at least based on my experience with DCAF, the concept began most dramatically and most sort of self-consciously in connection with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics, where you had a profound political transformation, they had a substantial security sector, and there had to be changes in that sector in order to work with the new democratic regimes. It's been hard enough, even in countries like that, or in Latin America, where you had a somewhat similar phenomenon. But the task has been even harder in other places. With the very important exception of the Balkans, the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and also South Africa and most of Latin America, have had the luxury of being able to do their security sector reform during what can fairly be called a security holiday. That is, a time in which there was no immediate internal or external security threat. That's not the case, obviously, in the Balkans or in places like Afghanistan or large parts of Africa or Lebanon or the Palestinian Authority, much less in Iraq. Their political transformations and internal reform have had to be promoted while at the same time the local security forces have had to deal with active opposition and continuing conflict. My central point this morning is that security sector reform is vastly more difficult when it must be done, so to speak, under fire. That is, in conditions of daily violence and well-supported, skilled campaigns to undermine internal security. That makes the task twofold, but more than twice as hard, because the security forces have to become more, not less, effective in strictly operational terms in the face of a well-organized, deeply committed, and ruthless armed opposition. At the same time, and I think this is the critical point, these very institutions have to be changed in non-operational ways so as to be compatible with a free and democratic society, more accountable, more law-based, more representative of the demography and the politics of the country, more transparent, more national, and less instruments of particular political, sectarian, or ethnic groups. In a benign environment, it may be possible to regard building professionalism and operational capacity as distinct from reform or even as a distraction from it. But that cannot be the case where the process of change, of the broader process of political change in the society, faces violent resistance. And it is certainly true that insurgencies, ethnic conflicts, and terrorism all have root causes, and these root causes must be addressed, and that a strictly military or law enforcement or internal security strategy will be ineffectual. But it is one of the many lessons of the 90s and of this decade that nation building in the broader sense of development, democratization, and internal reconciliation is all but impossible without security. Indeed, the enemies of success for the broader reform agenda can be expected to target exactly those so-called soft elements of reform that are most central to the process. Unless the local security forces, or some security forces, can protect this process, the effort to address real grievances and provide material inducements and political change will almost certainly fail. And this is true, I think, even in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, and indeed lots of other places where there are UN peacekeeping and forces and so on, where the initial burden of maintaining order is assumed to a large extent by outside forces. It's still true that local capacity has to be created, partly for the obvious reasons that Mark Sedra has identified, that the outsiders need some prospect of eventually being able to go home. But I think it's in a much more fundamental sense. That is, that until the local security authorities can deal with the security problem, you will not have succeeded in making the transformation that is necessary. And indeed, one of the critical parameters of the success of the broader internal process is confidence that the government and the security forces can in fact produce security. Because until the state, reformed or otherwise, can provide a reasonable degree of security, its claims to a monopoly of armed force will ring hollow, not just to the civilian populations, but to local militias, to private security companies, and indeed to the security institutions themselves. This is all complicated by the fact that in virtually every case, the pre-reform security institutions will almost by definition have been at best deeply compromised and at worst pillars of the old regime or agents of one of the factions. So the new security forces have to be fundamentally different from their predecessors. And quite apart from all the other reasons to accomplish SSR in a state in transition, building security capability even at the operational level will require fundamental reform and rebuilding, changing leadership, training, control, and oversight, and indeed basic institutional culture. In short, in the context like that which existed and still does exist to a large extent in Iraq, the new security institutions must be both increasingly effective and increasingly democratic, pluralistic, and law-abiding, which is not an easy combination. As you've heard, I was for a time in 2003 involved in trying to start this process in Iraq, and I've been a reasonably close observer of the process there and to a lesser extent elsewhere since I left. I certainly don't maintain that Iraq's lessons are necessarily universal, and still less that U.S. or Iraqi practice has been in any sense a model. Indeed, some of its elements have been the opposite. Still less is it my purpose here to argue either the justice of the war or the wisdom of the occupation, beyond observing that however things seemed at the time, and however much it is an unequivocally good thing that Saddam no longer rules in Baghdad, it's hard to believe that the United States would or should have mounted the operation if we had known at the time either the true facts about the state of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction programs or the costs to the United States, to Iraq, and to other countries that would follow the invasion. But that said, let me offer a few observations about the lessons that I draw from Iraq, from the Iraq experience. First, the process cannot be limited to the security sector alone. My experience and most discussions of security sector reform focus on how to create an effective and responsible local force, including military, police, intelligence components, judiciary, and so on. But it's fundamental that an effective program of security sector reform, even in the context of violent opposition, cannot be limited to the security instruments themselves. In the immediate crisis, both outside forces and the local military will take the lead in security. But ultimately, the objective must be to improve the police and the justice system and to degrade the insurgency to the point where not only can outsiders step back and eventually go home, but the local army can hand virtually full responsibility for internal security to the police. Moreover, and more broadly, security sector reform has to go hand in hand with reform in other sectors: governance, economics, social services, basic infrastructure. In the case of Iraq, errors of omission and commission by both the pre-war planners and the coalition military and civilian occupation authorities, in particular the failure to plan and resource adequately for the civil revival, made it easier for the initially Ba'ath-based insurgency to build support in the broader Sunni community and to attract outside support from Islamist fanatics, as well as within Iraq. Moreover, delays in confronting the Shia militias that were prepared to use violence played into the insurgent strategy of attempting to provoke Shia overreactions and broad sectarian violence. The second lesson, I think, is that efficiency has its costs. I emphasize the need for operational effectiveness, but let me be clear that I believe that it is a fundamental error to maintain that effectiveness always trumps reform, even in the most acute security conditions. Moreover, a single-minded attention to strictly military or police or intelligence effectiveness may lead, and is likely, in fact, to lead the security forces, both internal and external, to do things that are counterproductive. At a minimum, one has to reject claims that effectiveness can be secured by abuse. One of the many contradictions and paradoxes of the challenge is that the insurgents will prevail on the one hand if the security forces are ineffective in containing the violence, but they will also benefit if the security forces are or are seen to be brutal and heavy-handed, or the instruments of one faction or another in the society. Instilling the needed balance of toughness and restraint is a major task in preparing an effective security force, whatever its character. And not only is it necessary to avoid turning the effort into a recruiting drive for its enemies, but an effective counterinsurgency campaign must be fought, at least by any reasonably decent government, with some sense that the likely best outcome is not absolute victory, but an eventual compromise that will bring at least some elements of the opposition into the political system the government is trying to defend. That means that encouraging defections, being open to political compromise, decent treatment of detainees, restraint in operations, and building positive relations with populations prone to cooperating with the insurgency have to be high priorities, even in strictly security terms. Third, as a part of the process, constitutional civilian control and respect for the law must be established. Success requires that the security services that will serve the governmental order not only be strong enough to manage the nation's security, they must also be reasonably representative and reasonably responsive to the nation's new legal and constitutional order and respectful of the rights of its people. A critical part of SSR under fire is, therefore, establishing the constitutional and legal framework for setting and implementing national security policy and for commanding and overseeing the security forces. It will also be the case that establishing a government that is seen to be legitimate and representative will be crucial to building public support for the fight against those using violence to obstruct the reform process. And it will be important for maintaining the loyalty and the discipline of the security forces. The occupation authorities and the Iraqi government that has succeeded them were properly very conscious of the reality that Iraq was in the 1930s the birthplace of the modern Arab military coup. The very fact that security institutions are engaged in serious operations means that there is a danger that if they are effective in carrying out their critical mission, they will become a power unto themselves, even a threat to the government itself and the constitutional order. This danger can be particularly serious if the security forces are seen by the citizens, by foreign sponsors and mentors, and indeed by themselves, as the most efficient and powerful part of a generally weak institutional system. Interestingly, today in Iraq, the army and the police, for all their manifold failings, are, at least according to polling data, among the most respected of national institutions. Conversely, the civilian parts of the system, conscious of just this danger and of the potential political leverage to be gained from control of security organs of the state, may seek to make those institutions the instruments of personal or political power. Accordingly, structuring a program for building local security forces needs to be linked to the broader process of political development, including planning to create mechanisms for effective civilian management, oversight, and policy direction. The political authorities must have clear jurisdiction over budgets, personnel, policy, and while recognizing the legitimate claims of professional expertise, ultimate control over operations. Another lesson is that clarity of missions and allocation of responsibilities and command relationships are very important. An important element is defining the missions of the various security forces and so long as outside forces are present, their relationship to the outside forces. Of course, ultimately, internal security should be a police, not a military mission. In an effort to emphasize, this is one of the mistakes we made in Iraq, in an effort to emphasize that the army would serve the nation and not be a force as it had been under Saddam and indeed before, political control by any faction, namely the Sunnis, there was in the early stages in Iraq insufficient recognition that for many years at least, the Army's mission would be primarily one of internal security and not external defense. This affected both the initial focus of the training and the expectations of the soldiers and their officers. Moreover, it led to misunderstandings between Iraqi officers and soldiers and the coalition military authorities about the degree and manner in which the Iraqi army would be engaged in fighting Iraqi insurgents. But more broadly, conflicting and uncertain relationships among security institutions are endemic in the security field, even in highly stable societies. The United States is in the midst of a classic Tong war over who will have control over cyber operations right now. And in the chaotic context of an ongoing insurgency, these differences about responsibilities, roles, and missions, if you will, are even more common and even more dangerous. Moreover, whereas will often be the case, foreign forces who are likely to have their own conflicting internal doctrines and overlaps of authority, when they're involved, the problems will be all the greater. One of the most fundamental lessons, I think, of this whole process is that quality in the forces count, and quality takes time and costs money. In the immediate context of daily murderous attacks, there are understandable pressures for quick results, and some short-term measures, like relying initially on an inadequately trained former institutions, may be necessary, and it will certainly be tempting. Even more, there will be pressures from the sponsors for quick results at the cost of short-circuiting training and skimping on equipment. To be sure, there are some important security functions that can be done more or less adequately after very brief training and with minimal equipment and leadership structures. An example is providing sort of watchman-type guard services for fixed facilities. However, in the long run, it will be success in creating fully competent, self-sufficient, high-end institutions, especially in the police and the armed services, that will determine the outcome. The hard fact is that building such forces takes time and money and a gradual approach to committing them to action. But I think it's also true that it may actually be slower to try to do it fast because you have to keep doing it over and over again. The officer who was in charge, the American officer who was in charge of training, the actual operational training of the Iraqi army, liked to say that people always want things good, fast, and cheap. He said, I can almost always do one. I can sometimes do two, but I can never do three. The new Iraqi army was therefore designed as a high-end force with training periods equivalent to those that would be required to create equivalent new units in Western armies, up to a couple of years for a new divisional level unit and a corresponding scale of equipment and facility support. Efforts to create quickie forces, whether by brief retraining courses for former police units or local home guard elements, generally failed to produce units that reached even minimal level of competence. One of the things that I learned, I think I would have known it anyway, you can take a young man, this being an Arab country, the issue of young women hardly arose. You can take young men, give them about a week's training, teach them how to march, wear a uniform, salute. In Iraq, practically every male above the age of about 11 could assemble and disassemble an AK-47 blindfolded. And they look neat, but they aren't soldiers. And it's, I think, essential in planning a competent and a democratic, law-based security force to understand that it takes time to do it right. And the development of police units is even more complicated. I mean, I think it's a lot easier to train competent soldiers than competent police for a democratic society. And in Iraq, the development of police units has, by virtually all accounts, lagged behind the military, in part due to a combination of excessive reliance on pre-war structures and efforts to make do with highly abbreviated training programs. And that raises the issue of what I call build or repair. In almost all situations, there will be pre-existing security forces, whether they're the established institutions of the old regime or the militias and irregular forces of the movement that's recently come to power, or the defeated forces of a regime that's been ousted, whether by foreign forces or internal change. Thus, there will normally be an issue of whether to try to reform and reorient the existing institutions or start afresh. And of course, the issue is the institutions, not the individuals. The individuals, if they're prepared to accept the new regime, should be fully eligible to participate. In Iraq, for all the urban myth about the so-called disbanding of the old army, there was no real question of co-opting an existing military force or of having to see to the disarmament, demobilization, and reconstruction that is a favorite acronym in this field. The old army had disintegrated in the face of the coalition advance and the implosion of Saddam's regime. It was neither practical nor would it have been sensible to attempt to put the shattered structure back together again, the old Sunni-dominated force. By the contrast, the police, such as they were, did more or less still exist. In the event, the occupation authorities started a program to recruit, train, and equip an essentially new army. Officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted personnel from the former Iraqi army and from partisan and sectarian militias have been eligible to join the new forces, but as individuals, not parts of pre-existing units. In practice, most of the officer candidates, at least when I was involved in it, had prior experience either in the old army or in the Kurdish Peshmerga or in militias associated with the main Shia parties, Dawa and Skiri. Moreover, we found that some continuity in symbolic matters was useful. We deliberately designed the uniforms, insignia, and drill for the new Iraqi army based on those of the pre-Saddam Iraqi military and not those of the American army, to emphasize that the new force was a continuation of a more or less honorable national tradition, not an American imposition. In general, these elements of continuity were well received, even by non-Sunni elements, as reflecting the distinctively Iraqi nature of the new force. I think the fundamental reason to build rather than repair is that there's a real danger that reliance on the old security units will simply incorporate the defects, the old defects in the new effort. Moreover, particularly where the issue is bringing together diverse elements in a society or replacing an authoritarian and particularist regime with a more diverse and democratic one, if the old institutions are or are seen to be dominated, if the new institutions are or are seen to be dominated by servants of the old regime or a particular group within society, the process won't work. And I maintain that even measured by the pragmatic metric of the time necessary to get competent units into the fight, it may be quicker in practice to make a clean break with the past in doctrine and procedures in the existing security forces and personnel, especially at the, and change the personnel, especially at the senior leadership levels. So I think that for all the problems, the Iraq experience confirms that reforming existing institutions will often prove more difficult than starting from the ground up. One of the fundamental issues in Iraq, and I think in most of these cases, is that what I call the national unity principle is fundamental. Iraq is by no means the only one of these countries that will be a diverse nation if it remains a nation at all. Yet Iraq, like many of the others, is deeply divided internally, and those divisions have implications for the whole process of reform. It's critical that the security institutions not become the preserve of particular power groups, whether national or local. If they are to be accepted as truly acting for the nation and not for historically or even newly dominant groups, it's important that they be shaped so as to be national in character. In this respect, establishing the military in the more precise sense of the Army as a genuinely national institution will be particularly important because most of the other security organizations, notably the police, are likely and rightly to be essentially local and regional in orientation for both practical and policy reasons. By contrast, a national armed forces under the control of a national government will be an important element in the overall system where central and regional, even local powers are balanced so as to preserve national unity while protecting against abuse of central power, even when that power is based on an electoral majority, as it is in Iraq. That requires, and it is certainly required in Iraq, affirmative action to assure that people from communities excluded in the past on ethnic, sectarian, or political grounds are integrated into the forces. It also requires that some parts of the security forces, at least the National Army, be recruited and operated on a national basis, both as to, as to their composition and their deployment. In addition, of course, the security forces must be trained and led to respect both minority rights and central authority. The new Iraqi army was from the beginning intended to be a truly national force. Each unit, in principle down to the squad level, was to include people from all major groups in the population. As a matter of fact, we made a serious effort to make sure there were Kurds in the army, and we had the recruits, the trainees, in dormitory rooms of about 10 each. We learned you had to have 2 Kurds if you were going to have one, because otherwise the one would get beat up. Command slots were allocated on the basis of balance among the major groups. The recruits and, importantly, officer candidates were required to agree that they could be deployed anywhere in the country, not just in what one might call, quote, their ethnic areas. In practice, this goal has not always been achieved. In Iraq, the initial challenge was to induce Shia, who had traditionally largely been excluded from the leadership of the army and the other security forces, to join up. More recently, the problem has been that other groups have come to see the security forces as instruments of what they see as a Shia-dominated central government. And there have been very real dangers to Sunnis and their families who are known to cooperate with the government. Moreover, as the sectarian conflict worsened, some units had been proved unwilling to obey orders to deploy outside their local regions. For all these failings, the Army remains one of the relatively very few Iraqi institutions in which people of all groups work side by side on a daily basis. One of the most fundamental issues with security sector reform under fire, is that the process will have real enemies, and these must be resolutely prevented from destroying the process. But the emphasis has to be on reconciliation and a second chance. The objective is to win over the insurgents' base, not to eliminate it physically. There will always be some elements that are beyond compromise, but the emphasis must be on restraint in operations, respect for the local population, and a willingness to do those things which will encourage those who have supported the opposition eventually to join with the government. Usually the insurgency that a government's security forces must confront will be based on particular sections of the society, whether ethnic, sectarian, regional, or political, as the insurgency in Iraq is essentially a Sunni phenomenon. It's much more complicated in some ways than that, but that's essentially what it is. Even ostensibly ideological motivations may in practice be based heavily on ethnicity or regional links, as was the case, for example, in Malaya, where the insurgency, although communist in ideology, was supported largely by ethnic Chinese. Except for a relatively few at the top of the old system, a second chance, dependent on real acceptance of the new order, is the appropriate course. And at the same time, the issue is non-exclusion, not inherent in entitlement. There will have to be measures to affirmatively recruit new blood. There is an important practical lesson as well, which is that pay and quality of life issues are very important in reforming a security sector. The centrality of quality personnel to the effort and the fact that loyalty and dedication of the key personnel are both assets and a potential critical vulnerability means that pay, benefits, and living conditions are a major factor in reform. Barracks, food, hygiene, medical care, leave arrangements, uniforms can be as important as monetary compensation. Pay rates must be set at levels that at least match other jobs in the public sector. Moreover, and this is a huge problem in lots of countries, the troops must actually be paid regularly and through arrangements including accurate records of who is actually serving in the unit and entitled to payment that make skimming, kickbacks, and other forms of corruption difficult. Mechanisms have to be provided for individual soldiers to arrange for part of their pay to be received by their families, and for pensions and other compensation for families when soldiers are killed and wounded. These sound like trivial practical problems, but believe me, they can be of overwhelming importance in the kind of conditions we found in Iraq. Corruption is a key issue. Societal transition seldom comes untarnished by, quote, ordinary crime and corruption. No police or security system is entirely free from corruption. And in the turmoil of SSR under fire, there are lots of things that are more important than perfect financial rectitude. But the tempering of generations of despotism with endemic corruption will, in most of the countries in issue, have left a corrosive legacy. Indeed, the prevalence of corruption is often one of the main sources of support for the insurgency and opposition to reforms. The security forces, because they combine arms, authority, and resources, are particularly susceptible to corruption. Principles of merit promotion, law-based decision, and rejection of the use of public office for personal gain are nowhere fully realized in practice, but attaining at least minimum standards of integrity and abstinence from political involvement are essential goals. Perhaps the most fundamental lesson is that leadership is critical. That, I think, is true in almost any human institution, but it is emphatically true in security organizations. And in the conditions that we're talking about, there will be competition from quality people, hopefully from a growing economy and, indeed, under conditions of violence, from opportunities abroad. The targeting of security personnel, particularly in police and local government, acts as a further deterrent to effective service. So the new security organization must give their people adequate salaries and protection for their families and property. But in a broader sense, the quality of the leaders will determine the performance of the rank and file. It is relatively easy to train reasonably competent individual soldiers. But what makes for an effective military unit, and particularly a military unit or a police or other security unit that is compatible with a democratic society, is leadership, and that is far harder to train for. It is essential to move to a transformed ethos of discipline, integrity, and leadership, replacing the old habits in security sector institutions, which were characterized by a mixture of brutality, passivity, politicization, concealment, and corruption, is not easy. All militaries are hierarchical and slow to adapt, sometimes for good reasons. And those of nations challenged by insurgency are likely to be particularly inflexible or corrupt and rank conscious. Overcoming those tendencies and ensuring that able young, or at least by rank junior, officers can reach senior positions rapidly are high priorities in attempting to create good forces. To some degree, it's possible to identify potential leaders in the recruiting process, or at least to avoid those candidates least likely to succeed. In Iraq, the Army training program put heavy emphasis on identifying individuals with leadership potential. Officer candidates competed for rank rather than being assured of their formal status or recruited on the basis that they would have a particular rank. But deeply ingrained habits die hard, and there were too many reports of officers selling promotions and pocketing pay, as well as refusing at the completion of training to accept commissions at lower ranks than they thought they were entitled to, particularly if they'd previously held higher ranks in the old Army or in militias. Pre-entry vetting is necessarily minimal. I'm not convinced we're very good at doing it, even in societies we understand perfectly, but it was virtually impossible in conditions in Iraq, if only because of lack of reliable records. Iraq has, I think, reconfirmed the familiar lesson that much of the real training and a very large part of the real leadership selection process happens after people have completed most of their formal training, as they gradually move from simpler to more complex and challenging missions. Trainers, both coalition and later Iraqi, had considerable discretion to discharge candidates for non-performance or evidence of lack of commitment. But finding and advancing competent leaders, especially at senior levels, still largely filled by veterans of the old system, has continued to be a major problem. Finally, the key decisions have to be made ultimately by locals. To the degree that Iraq or other countries will need external help, the foreign states and international institutions will have interests and requirements by which they will legitimately seek to shape the process. However, the basic political decisions on how a reforming country deals with its security challenges must be made by and must have the support of the leading political forces in the country. And that support must come in the context of agreement on basic constitutional structures and political arrangements. There are few enough countries, even those without serious internal security concerns, that have militaries and especially police forces that are thoroughly effective, law-abiding, non-corrupt, broadly representative of the demography of the country, accepted by minority or other disadvantaged populations, professional, financially clean, and apolitical. The Iraq case illustrates the whole range of problems of creating or reforming security forces and the limits of good intentions backed by massive, dedicated, and richly resourced effort. 6 years of hard work by brave and dedicated Iraqis, Americans, and other coalition personnel, both military and civilian, and billions of dollars in financial support have produced some Iraqi units that are able to make a significant contribution, even if they have not so far produced forces with any prospect of immediately taking over fully from the coalition forces. Progress has been painfully slow, and the security situation, although much improved from the depths of a couple of years ago, is, as recent events have demonstrated, far from adequate, much less stable. As we go forward in security sector reform around the world, it is important to pay careful attention to the lessons of the past, and I have been struck in preparing for this event at how relatively little systematic evaluation there is of what has and has not worked. There's a lot of prescription of what the process should involve, relatively little description of what has and hasn't worked. And I hope that this conference will be a contribution to that pragmatic and practical evaluation. Thank you.